Okay. Not sure anything will come out of this hand, but we'll have a look at it anyway. Just maybe we'll. This is a hand I played in the WSOP. It was one of the first hands I played. It was the second major hand I played. The first hand I'd flopped a set and won a decent sized pot, so I'd moved from 60k up to 80k. Now remember, I came in on day 2, so that's 100 big blinds essentially at this stage.
Yeah.
And what happened in this hand was, it came around to me on the button. I thought it had been folded around to me, but it hadn't been. Under the gun had actually raised. So I put out the chips to raise, and it turned out it was a call. Now, it doesn't make too much difference because the hand I had 6-4 suited, as we can see in a GTO setting, that's a call 65% of the time anyway.
Yeah.
So it's fine, but yeah, just for the sake of thing. Now, this hand is slightly off as well because the big blind called as well, so it was 3-way, but the big blind check folded the flop. So yeah. So I thought, well, I could run it in. So yeah, so I've called with 6-4 of diamonds. The flop comes 5-3-2. Nice flop, obviously, for my hand.
Yeah, typical old playing aces and kings only. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, with one of my diamonds. So big blind checked. The German guy who was like very aggro cash type player, he led fairly big, 3/4 pot, which is really fucking weird on this board. I obviously call, no point at all in raising as far as I could see. And the big blind folds. And then the turn was a king of spades, which obviously is a better card for him. So he kept going. He bet 65% of pot. And I called again, see, not seeing any real reason to raise. But then when I talked to some very good players afterwards, they said they would have raised in this spot to try and get it in. So that's why I ran the hand. But I did call, and then the river came the 10 of diamonds, essentially a brick. He checked, and I remember thinking at the time, I think I'm supposed to go big here because I have a polar range. So I think I'm supposed to shove, but I think he's full of shit. I think he has a very weak hand or nothing. And the best way to try and get value from that is to bet small, and maybe his nothings will check raise as a bluff, thinking I won't call it off. I like going for thin value, and his weak hands will side call because it's a small bet. If he has something like queens or jacks. So I bet small, and he tanked for a long time and folded. So the two interesting points for me were the turn and the river. I thought the rest was fairly straightforward. So if we ignore the fact that the big blind is in the hand and just look at the two ranges, you can see that he does have the slight range advantage here, but it's pretty slight. It's like 54 to 46. And like he has lots of green stuff in this range, or lots of yellow stuff in his range. So that really doesn't want to build a big pot. So really his range mostly wants to check, and that's borne out by the solver here is checking almost 95%. My range has some strong stuff, has lots of yellow stuff, and has lots of weak stuff as well. So the way it should have played out is he should have checked, and I should have bluffed my weakest hands, value bet my strongest hands, and checked everything else. So like the bear over pair is mostly checking. The stronger ace high is mostly checking. But then turning stuff like queen 8 suited into a bluff, because they're my weakest hands. But he did bet big, and my hand is just a pure call. Obviously, against the bigger bet, there's very little raising. And 6-4 suited never raises, so I do call. So as we go to the turn, then you can see his range disadvantage has disappeared now, but the ranges are running close together. We can't really see his range because he's not supposed to have done this bet. So PO isn't color coding it. But anyway, And we can see from the numbers that he has some very strong hands, he has some very weak hands, and he doesn't have too much in the middle. Whereas my range has much more stuff in the middle, but I have protected it by calling some super strong hands as well. So that's before the turn card comes down. The turn card, so remember, it's 48 to 52. When the king of spades comes on the turn, that changes things. That's a good card for him. And he obviously moves into a slight range advantage. But it's pretty small. So because of that, he's supposed to bet fairly frequently, but small, because essentially he has a slight range advantage here, but he doesn't have an utter advantage. Like, he doesn't have.
When we look at the equities here, it's based on the entire range pre-flop, not based on the hands that would have progressed to this stage.
No, it's the hands that have progressed to this stage, yeah.
But no hands have progressed to that stage.
Sorry?
But no hands have progressed to that stage.
Well, some have. The ones that have numbers here on the grid. If we go back to, it's going to be very minor. Like this is his betting range.
Oh, is this like 4%?
This is his betting range. It's only 0.15%.
Oh, right.
But it is like all of those hands
it's are in their percentage. It's just not showing.
Are in a tiny amount of the time,
right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
They're not showing because they're such minuscule percentages. But nevertheless, PO has calculated how that range should play, if that's the range that we get to there.
Right.
That's why it's useful sometimes to leave these options in, even though they're not supposed to be used. It's just to see, well, if the guy does use them, what should we do?
Yeah.
So he has, this is his range, like 0.0018% of the time he has this hand, 0.0014% he has this type of hand, etc. Those are the equities associated with them.
Yeah.
My range is much easier to read because I should have all of these hands at some frequency. Yeah. So again, he's supposed to either bet small or check. He's not supposed to bet the big size that he did. In fact, he's only supposed to use that size 0.31% of the time. So now we're getting into like 0.31% of 0.15%. So we're really getting into sort of, but nevertheless, we can see what I'm supposed to do against that bet. So against that, well, first of all, as I said, he has moved into a slight range advantage, but he doesn't have an utter advantage. And normally in those cases, you can't bet 100% of the time, but you should be betting some of the time, but you should be betting small. Essentially, all you're doing is you're giving the weakest hands in my range a difficult decision. They either have to fold away their equity or they have to put more money into the pot when they're well behind. But he chooses this larger size. And then we can see my hand is a pure call, which is interesting because a lot of very good players got this wrong. But it's a case of like they're thinking about what they want to happen. What they want to happen is they want to get the whole stack in, but it doesn't actually make any sense with the overall range. It's a general principle. I've noticed this before in PO that when we have a very strong hand in position and the other guy keeps betting, PO almost never raises.
No.
It'll wait until the guy either checks to put the money in itself, or it'll wait till the river and then shove over his bet on the river. But it wants him to keep. It's the old phrase of like, why push the cart if the donkey will keep pulling it for you?
Yeah. It's PO obviously favors just when they can guarantee. It's like locking up a ICM. PO likes it when he can guarantee two bets.
Exactly.
Turn and river when.
Yeah, like if we shove here and he folds his bluff, that's it. We just fold out all his bluffs basically. That's the only thing we kind of really achieve. If he has a genuinely strong hand, he's probably going to put the money in on the river anyway. So we do call, and then so let's look at what happens on the call. So now we have the slight in position has a range advantage, but it's quite slight. Again, it's difficult to see. Well, actually, his range. No, it's not that difficult to see. His range is mostly polar. He has some very strong hands, a lot of very strong hands, the high numbers. a lot of very weak hands, the very low numbers, but he has some stuff in the middle too, I guess. So he just has a kind of a spread out range, if you want to call it that. My range is very, very well. I have protected it, but I don't have weak stuff anymore. I guess I just have a linear range for the most part. What is the weak stuff? Okay, I've called it some gut shots just because why not? But yeah, gut shots are my weakest hands. Pretty much everything else is very strong. Oh, sorry, medium to very strong. So yeah, range advantage has flipped in my favor. And the river was the 10 of diamonds. 10 of diamonds is kind of a brick. It's slightly better for him than me, but nothing major there. So again, if we look at his range, okay, he has these high numbers. He has all this ace-x, which is just middling ace-x, which is nothing, and these lower pairs, which are stuff like fours is not great either now, sixes, sevens, etc. But then he does have some stuff like queens, jacks, tens, nines, which is medium strength, and some king x. So again, he doesn't really have a polar range, and he doesn't have but he still has a lot of weak hands in his range. So again, yeah, betting, yeah. So actually so he has some very strong hands, some very weak hands, and some middling hands. So his middling hands will mostly want to bet small, kind of as a blocker, and get called by worse and not have to face a bigger bet. His strong hands will mostly want to bet big to try and get value, obviously, and balance that with some weak hands which want to bluff. So you can see that PO is now actually splitting almost 50-50 when it does bet.
Yeah, this is good. This is a good example.
Yeah, in fact, and there's checking as well. Some of them we can't block. The check range will be interesting to look at. What is the check range? Of course, it's all fucking zero because we're down so small.
If you click on the strategy, doesn't that show you the?
That's right. Yeah. Well, actually, no. It's.
Oh, it's still really.
Yeah, like we're literally down. We're so far down now.
And it shows you nothing.
Let me see. Maybe the range explorer will show me. Okay, the range explorer is better. So yeah, so we have some give ups. We can't just bluff everything, because we're going to end up with too many bluffs then, because we have so much garbage. So we have stuff at the bottom that just gives up. Then we have some stuff that is marginal showdown value, like third pair. That's most of the range, but we can't just check medium strength, weak showdown hands and no showdown hands, because then he can obviously attack our checks. So we do hold back our sets and our straights some of the time. Yeah, so we have to have a balanced range basically for the check range. The small bet range, you can see this is the value part of it. Yeah, so the weaker showdown hands like second and third pair, they're mostly checking because they can't get called by worse, but they can win if it goes check. The stronger, the slightly stronger ones like top pair and over pair, they're being bet small, and then some of our worst hands are being bluffed as well because they obviously benefit the most from getting folds. But we do have to protect this range as well, because if this range was capped, he could attack it as well. So our straights and our sets are probably balanced between the three ranges. They'll sometimes be checked, they'll sometimes be bet small, and they'll sometimes be bet big. They'll mostly want to bet big because they want value, obviously. And the medium strength hands, this part here, the over pairs and top pairs, will mostly want to bet a small amount. And then these hands here, the weaker showdown type hands, will mostly want to check, but you have to split them all because you can't just play face up. But when we look at the big bet range, you can see now this is the value part. We're not betting top pair at a big size anymore because that doesn't make sense. We can't get called by worse.
No.
So the big bet range is polar. It's the strongest and the weakest. The middle bet range, the small bet range is less polar. In fact, it's mostly medium strength hands, good medium strength hands, but it's also obviously has to have some bluffs and it has to have some stronger hands for protection. And the check range is driven by this part here, the weak showdown hands that just want to go check, but they have to be protected as well by some stronger hands. And then there's just the give ups as well. We bluff at a frequency with our worst hands to balance out the value in this range and this range, but we're still left with some hands. We can't bluff them all, because if we bluff them all, we just end up with too many bluffs.
With the hands that we bluff with, it's obviously, if this was a more realistic range, we'd be able to see this easily without even having to dig deep. But with the hands that we bluff with, would we pick certain hands to bluff with in the big bet range over? Sorry, are there better bluff candidates for big bet range?
100%. If we look at the bluffs in the big bet range, you'll see that they mostly come from ace highs. And that will be down to blocker effects. They will block stuff like ace king. They'll block ace four. In a big bet range, blockers are far more important than showdown, because none of your weak hands will have any showdown. So showdown's out of the window. So really it just all comes down to blockers. And you can see actually the third pair is sometimes turned into a bluff. And that's because it's blocking it. That has to do with its blocker effects rather than its value. It can never get called by a worse hand, but it blocks pocket fives. It blocks ace five.
Yes.
Ace five probably doesn't matter. Ace five is not going to call the big bet, but it blocks pocket fives. So. And
then, but the small bet bluffs would be more the completenesses.
You can see the small bet is mostly just the nothings.
Right.
The hands that have the least showdown, because if they can get a slightly better nothing to fold, that's an amazing result for them, and they will get some slightly better. Like when you bet small, pretty much the only stuff that folds is nothing. But our absolute nothings, which are worse than ace high, so queen highs and worse, if they can get ace high to fold, that's brilliant.
So it's not because of how the frequency with which they will successfully get people to fold, because obviously if you've got a blocker, you're going to make people fold more often.
Correct. But that's more important. That's more important when you're betting big. When you're betting small, that's not really it's not going to make that much of a difference.
So with a big bet, we want the frequency of folds to be in our favor.
Correct.
And a blocker will achieve that because we're risking more, obviously.
Because we're risking more, exactly. Yeah.
But with a small bet, it's like an ROI bonus if we can actually pick up the pot with nothing. That's the way of thinking.
Yeah.
We're not too bothered if we lose, because
exactly. We had the worst hands which have no other way of winning, but they can sometimes win this way. So like that adds a ton to the record. Like if you look at the, maybe we can't even see it. See the EV. Okay, yeah. You can see, for example, the EV of Queen 9 suited is 8.39. Now Queen 9 suited is garbage on this board. That just comes from when it bets small and it gets a fold. Because it's never going to win a showdown.
No.
So all the EV of the weakest, and you can
because the ace high hands could be ahead sometimes when you check back. That's the other thing.
That's it. Yeah, like when we look at the check range, you'll see that the ace highs are usually checked. Like if you look at if we focus on the ace highs, just look at this thing here. That's how often they're checked. That's how often they're bet small. Almost never, because it doesn't make any sense. And that's how often they're bet big.
Right.
So they either want to be checked and go check and win some of the time, or they want to bet big and force better hands to fold. They don't want to bet medium, because that makes no sense.
No.
They won't get called by worse hands, and they won't fold out too many better hands. They probably won't fold out any better hands. In fact, at that really small size.
Yeah. All you essentially do is let the guy fist pump when they hero call you with pocket sixes or something like that, and
Yeah.
you're like, yeah, hit ace, I did it. Yeah, this is interesting. Yeah.
And like if you look at the EVs of your ace highs, like it's of the worst ace highs, it's almost nil. Which means that like, but it comes from different places. Like if you check ace eight suited, it'll win sometimes, not very often, but it'll win once in the blue moon. What's the EV of or actually that is the EV, yeah. It'll win once in the blue moon. You'll also bet it big some of the time and get folds and win that way. But when you check, you're not giving up very much either. So or sorry, when you check, it'll win sometimes. When you bet big, it'll sometimes fold a better hand. So like the important thing to I guess to remember is, another important point is it's the value which really drives stuff. Like when we're betting big, we need a very strong hand for value. We need an overpair or better. We have to balance that. Because we're betting big, blockers are more important. We want to block the calls. So the best blocker we can have is an ace.
Yeah.
So most of the bluffs are coming from the ace highs. When we bet small, we're mostly betting top pair type hands just for value, trying to get called by worse. We don't need as many bluffs. So we don't need, you can see that like here, there's a lot of bluffs. Here, not so much bluffs. The red stuff are the bluffs. But we're using our nothings, our worse than ace highs. Because the ace highs have some showdowns. We just used our lowest showdown hands basically. And then when we check, that's mostly just the rest, the stuff that doesn't make any sense. Now we're out of position, so we do have to protect our checking range as well. So that's why you can see if you focus on the top of the range, sets and straights, that's how often they're checked. That's how often they're bet medium. That's how often they're bet big. You can see that they mostly want to bet big, particularly the straights, because the straights don't block his really strong hands. When you have a set, you block a lot of his strong hands. If you have a set of kings, you block all his top pair. If you have a set of tens, you block his 10x. So they make less sense to bet big than the straights. The straights, ace 4 and 6-4, don't block his sets in two pairs. So if you focus on the sets, bet big, bet medium, check. You can see they mostly want to bet big. Next preferred option is to bet small. Least preferred option is to check. But you still have to check some of the time because you can't have a range which never has the top. Because then you condense your range basically and the guy can just overbet. So you have to protect. Now, if you look at the sets, that's bet big, that's bet small, and that's check. That's far more balanced. That's kind of being apportioned equally over the three ranges. And that's being driven by the fact that the straights really want to bet big. Like they pretty much only want to bet big. And if you were up against somebody who like wasn't balanced, was never picking up on your tendencies and wasn't capable of exploiting you in the future, probably the only option you should ever do with your straights is bet big. But the reason why you can't do that in GTO world is if you always bet big with your straight, then when you bet small or you check, you don't have the straight.
Yeah.
And the guy can attack you for that result, that reason. Similarly, when you look at the bottom of the range, you can see if we look at nothings, this is bet big. Makes no sense to bet a nothing big because it doesn't have blockers.
Yep.
This is bet small. Makes much more sense to bet small. So that's where the bluffs are mostly coming from, and then has to check the rest of the time. Whereas the ace highs, this is bet big. These are the best bluffs when you're betting big. Makes much less sense when you bet small. And then the rest of the time has to be checked as well. But it's the value. It's how much stuff you have up here, which determines how much stuff you can bluff with down here. So when you're betting big, you can bluff almost, well, you need a 2-to-1 bluff ratio. I guess it's a pot size bet, is it? Where can I see the pots? Yeah, it's roughly a pot size bet. So you need a 2-to-1. So there's about twice as many combos up here as there are down here. But when you bet small, you need far more value. All the stuff appears the value, so you don't need as many bluffs. You don't get away with as many bluffs, and then everything that's left over is just a check range.
This has been particularly useful because I think the back of my mind thing that I'd carried into all these sessions so far is that range construction on the river is like something that you should plan multi-street, whereas it really is just a case of, right, this river card has changed everything, and it's almost like you just do range construction on each street independently almost.
Yeah,
that's plan for it with the hands that you play, but
you can never achieve perfect board coverage across all runouts. Some cards just favor one player more than the other, and there's nothing you can do about that. Sorry, there is something you can do about it, but you can't fully protect against it. Sometimes one player just has a range advantage because of the card which has come, and you just kind of have to accept that. But at the same time, you have to try and construct your ranges so that as much as possible, you're protecting yourself in every possible run out. That's why we bluff with backdoors.
Yes.
Because backdoors give us a lot of turn cards and river cards where if we hit our backdoor, we've improved the value. If we don't hit our backdoor, we probably have a good bluff candidate. Whereas if you just pick a random hand to bluff with, like on ace 5-6, something like 8-7, no, 9-8, something like 9-8 makes a good bluff candidate. 9-8 suited with a backdoor flush draw, because a 7 will make us a really strong hand on the turn, which we can value bet. One of our suit will give us a flush draw, which we can turn into a semi bluff, and we can turn a gut shot, which will also give us a semi bluff. And when we have the semi bluff, sometimes we'll get there on the river and be able to value bet, and sometimes we'll still have nothing and have a good bluff candidate because we only have 9 high. That's why that makes a much better bluff than your random king 8 suited or king 8 offsuit, say. That's kind of how you achieve board coverage, but you'll never be able to protect perfectly. Like in that situation, it's going to be very hard to protect when 2 high card come, because that will just favor the other guy's range more. But yeah, it's like on the river, it's generally a case of recognizing what your range looks like and what your strong hands want to do. In a situation where you don't have any super strong hands, you have lots of medium strength hands, you'll generally want to bet small. But in a situation where you have in a situation where you have a truly polar range, you have no medium strength hands, you will only want to bet big. But it's more realistic in a lot of cases where you're going to get to the river with both types of hands. Or all types of hands. You're going to have strong, medium, and weak. The strong hands are going to want to bet big still, and the medium hands are still going to want to bet small. So you end up splitting your range, as is the case here. You have a big bet size and a small bet size. And actually, maybe that's the way we get this across. We show when you get to the river with a polar range that you always bet big or check, and when you get to the river with a more condensed range, you always bet small or check. But when you get to the river with strong, medium, and weak, what happens in this case you're pretty much splitting between the 3 things almost equally. Bet big, bet small, check. The bet big range will be the polar range. That'll have the strongest hands plus the best blocker bluffs. The bet small will have the mostly the medium strength hands with the nothings, which mostly benefit from getting better nothings to fold, and then the check range will be what's left over.
This is I mean, I've since we last spoke, practical reasons mostly, but I've been almost exclusively playing cash games, And I've been playing them like 50 big blind buy-in, just so it will mirror what I've been looking at on GTO and stuff. And my game has changed tremendously in a very small amount of time because I'm now really paying attention to bet sizing.
That's good. Yeah.
I'm surprised how, well, first of all, I'm surprised how much it drives everything that you do, but also I'm surprised how I was just doing monkey see, monkey do with my bet sizing up until this point.
Yeah.
And this is all really slotting in now. I think this probably is the sort of way to get it all across, just how you can have two separate ranges within when you're on the river and bet sizes determine and stuff.
Yeah. And like the two key points on that are obviously the big hands want to bet big, and we balance that with the best blocker bluffs, and the weaker value hands want to bet small, and we balance that with our nothings, and then the rest is check. But both the check and the bet small range have to be protected some of the time by the very strong hands. But that's only true if you're up against really good players who will recognize that you're capping, that you always bet your really strong hands.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I want to get across in this book, because like everything I've written so far is very formulaic. I'm sure it's been written before, explanations of things like bluff to value and stuff like that. One of the things I want to get across in this book is like, you know how we have key takeaways at the end of all our chapters in the previous books?
Yeah.
I'd almost want to replace that with ways you can apply this in real life at the tables. Because obviously no one's going to be able to replicate any of this stuff, just like a nosebleed player wouldn't be able to do it either. But, you know, for example, betting with a double backdoor or something is something that you could do in a normal exploitative home game environment or something like that. So that's kind of one of the things that I want to.
That's good to put in actual practical implementations or suggestions.
I had a question as well, which I've been meaning to ask you for quite some time, which is, since I've been doing this, the old maxim in poker used to be like, you know, when you start at poker, you think about your own hand and your own range, and then when you become advanced as a player, you spend more time thinking about your opponent's hand and opponent's range and stuff. I've noticed since I've been looking through all this stuff with you that I think about my own range more now, relatively, like whatever the ratio is, then I think about my opponent's range. Like, for example, a good turn card will come for me and I'll be like, right, well, you know, these are the hands I should be betting with, and these are the hands I should be checking with, and so on. And, you know, because it's got a blocker or something like that. And I find myself thinking less about my opponent's range overall. Is that a thing, or am I just not?
Well, I mean, often they're essentially kind of mirrored in the sense that like the good cards for you are the bad cards for him, and vice versa.
Oh yeah.
So that's true. And to be honest, like your own range does drive your strategy more than his range. Like if you have a polar range, you want to bet big. It doesn't matter too much what his range looks like. You still want to bet big, and you want to bluff with the right candidates. And when you have a more linear range, you still want to bet small, and it really doesn't matter too much what his range looks like. As an example, when you raise under the gun and big blind calls, there's almost no board on which you're not supposed to see bet 100%.
Yeah.
So you can kind of just like, it's useful to think about his range, but it's not as useful as what you think about your range. That tends to drive your own strategy much more. Now, as you get down into the weeds, it becomes more important to think about the other guy's range. But to be honest, you are still, first of all, there's the mirroring effect of like, well, if it's good for me, it's probably bad for him. And if it's bad for me, it's probably better for him. But then there is the other thing of like your strategy will still be driven mostly by how strong your range is. I'm trying to think of exceptions to that. I mean, the exceptions to that, I mean, even it's difficult to think of exceptions because, like, let's take button versus big blind. Like, again, there are some boards where button is supposed to check behind more dynamic boards. But again, that's kind of more driven by his range as well, by his own range. I mean, one thing I've spotted recently is that on, like, when people think of, you know what a dynamic board and a static board is, right?
Yeah, you mean like a 9-10 jack with 2 spades would be a dynamic board, and
you're giving exactly the answer I wanted, because this betrays a very common flaw in people's thinking. A dynamic board is a static board is a board in which the hand values won't change very much. So whoever has the best hand right now is probably going to have the best hand at the river.
Yeah.
And a static board is where a dynamic board is where there are lots of cards that can come which will completely change the hand values.
Yeah.
Which can be drawy boards. But what people also miss is, for example, which is a more dynamic board? Ace 9-6 with two of the same flush, two flush cards, or 9-3 deuce rainbow.
Only based on our discussion right now, I'd probably go 9-3 deuce rainbow, because, you know, like a queen or a king or a
that's exactly right. Most people focus on flush draws and straight draws, but actually a far more important factor is how the highest card is. Because on a 9-3-2 board, if you have the best hand right now with ace 9 or a pair, any overcard will throw that into doubt. Whereas on the ace 9-6 board, even though 8-7 is an open ender and there's possible flush draws there, it's far more important the fact that if you have an ace right now and you're ahead, you're far more likely to stay ahead than if you have ace 9 on the 9 high board. Because, you know, if the guy has 2 overcards and any of them come, he pulls ahead of you. Whereas on the ace 9-6 board, his pair outs aren't good anymore. So pair outs actually drive dynamic versus static more than obvious draws, because obvious draws tend to be just a tiny portion of the range. Like there's almost no spot where on an ace 9-6 board one player has 8-7 a lot of the time and the flush draw a lot of the time. It's usually just a small part of the range. But whereas like on 9-3-2, they're going to have king queen, king jack, king 10, queen jack, etc., etc. That's going to be a huge chunk of the range. So on a board like 9-3-2, you should always bet bigger. On an ace high board, you should tend to bet smaller, because it's a static board. But on a 9 high board, with your value, you should always tend to bet big on your bluffs as well, obviously, for balance. But yeah.
With the 9 high board, like an undergun ranger is going to have a more polar range, right, as well, because it's just that the relative hand strengths shrink, and an overpair is now a really, really strong hand. So you go for a polar pair.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on stack depth as well, too. I was like, at 40 big blinds, an overpair is a monster, but at 200 big blinds, pocket 10 isn't that big a monster anymore. And yeah, on very dynamic boards.
I think I've been making this mistake, actually. I think I've been, when I've been like the under the gun guy, I think I've been betting small on a 9-3-2 board, because my logic is like, oh, well, people can't have much of anything, so I'll bet small just to, you know, get value from a wide range of hands. But no, it makes more sense to me to overbet with the ace kings and the pocket 10s there, I suppose.
Well, it obviously depends on your value hand as well, like how vulnerable it is. Like if you have aces, it makes more sense to bet smaller. But when you have 10s or ace 9 suitors, it makes more sense to go bigger.
So would you call a 9-10 jack board with 2 spades a dynamic board, but just not as dynamic as a 9?
Oh no, that's super dynamic. I mean, that's as dynamic as it comes. Like jack 10-9, like you're scared of all the overcards, you're scared of the straightening cards. Right. You're scared of the cards on the board. No, that's as dynamic as it comes. Okay. I'm just making the point that sometimes people overrate a board like 8-8-7 and think, oh, 8-8-7 with a flush shot, go, oh, that's super dynamic because there's like 9-10 9-6, 6-5, and the flush draws.
Mm.
But then they look at a board like a 9-3-2 and go, well, 5-4 is the only open end. There's no flush draw, so that's not a very dynamic board. But actually, it is very dynamic because of the overcards are suddenly significant cards that can come on the turn that can change hand values.
Not to be confused with wet and dry boards, I guess.
Correct. Yeah, that's it. I think people think wet boards are the only dynamic boards, and dry boards are the static board. Dry and static mean dry boards are always static. Is that true? No, they're not. No, it's not even true. Because like 9-4-2 is dry. 9-4-2 rainbow is dry, but it's not static.
Yeah.
No, they're completely different things. Static boards, and they're super important because on a static board, the hand values won't change very much. So it makes sense to bet small. But on a dynamic board, the hand values will change. So if you believe you have the strongest hand right now, you should bet big. You benefit much more from folds. Like bets, like people think in terms of value bets and bluffs, but like very few hands are pure value bets and very few hands are bluffs. Like bets, for a good way to think about it is, if you're considering betting a hand, think about like, if I bet this hand, how much does it benefit from calls? And how much does it benefit from folds?
Yeah.
Like if you bet the nuts, obviously that benefits brilliantly from calls because you made the pot bigger. It doesn't benefit from folds because you've got the nuts. Well, maybe it does. Like maybe even the nuts can be drawn out on. But it benefits only a very small amount from folds, a large amount from calls. If you bet a really shit hand, that benefits a lot from folds and almost nothing from calls. Now, you still don't want to bluff with hands that benefit nothing from calls. That's why you pick like a semi-bluff is better than a bluff, because if the board is a 7-6 rainbow, if you bet 10-9, obviously you benefit greatly from folds, because even if you had the best hand, they've had presumably 6 live outs against you. But you also benefit a little bit from calls, because if they call, you might hit your 8 and have a monster. You might hit a flush draw on the turn and be able to bet again. So it's not a disaster when you're called. You do actually benefit something from calls. You're better off betting hands that benefit from both calls and folds than hands which benefit from, and you should never bet a hand which benefits from neither. Like
middle strength hands,
medium strength hands, like a hand like pocket kings, for example, on that board. Like the guy folds, okay, he probably folded 2 undercards. Big whoop. We don't benefit at all from that. The guy calls, now we don't like our kings anymore. We've made the pot bigger. So so on that board, it doesn't make any sense to bet that type of hand. But on a board like Jack 8-4, or actually, sorry, if we go back to 8-7-6, it makes more sense to bet 3s or 2s on that board than to bet kings, because that benefits from folds. If you get Jack 10 to fold when you bet, that doesn't benefit you at all when you have kings, but it benefits you greatly when you have 2s or 3s, because that had roughly 25% equity against you. So that's the way you should be thinking as well. Like, how much do we benefit from calls? How much do we benefit from folds? And if the answer is we have a hand which benefits not much from either, then it's not a bet, it's a check. Now, sometimes our range is so strong that we should bet anyway. Like in the first example, we looked where even pocket 8s was betting. That's just a range bet. That's just like our range is really strong. Therefore, we're going to bet the entire range at a small amount. But I guess, but even a hand betting 8s on a board, like what was the first one we looked at? It was ace something, ace king 9. When we bet pocket 8s on ace king 9, that does benefit to some degree from folds. Like when we get queen high or jack high to fold, that's good, because it has equity against us. But yeah, that's a good way to think in terms of like, should my range be betting or checking? When you have a lot of medium strength hands, it obviously makes sense to check because you're betting those medium strength hands doesn't really achieve anything. Doesn't benefit from calls, doesn't benefit from folds. When you have a polar range, it makes sense to bet big because the strong hands benefit from calls, the weak hands benefit from folds. And then when you have the split range, like in the example we've just looked at, now you can see why it makes sense to bet strong with your best medium hands, because they can get called by worse medium hands. It makes sense to bet bigger with your strongest hands because they can get called by worse, and then you get to bluff as well and fold out better hands. Cool. So yeah. So do you have any other questions?
No, this is perfect. I now have a pretty solid vision of what I want this entire section to look like. Awesome. I think you filled in most of the gaps that I was kind of struggling with. Yeah, so I actually think the next thing for me to do is just crack away at it and show you what would be like a very, very rough, I guess, like it's quite a big section there. It could be like a third of the book or something, actually, because one of the things that I'm doing prior to the river is explaining all the big concepts, you know, things like range advantage and bluff to value and things like that. All these things that people need to, not in much detail, because I'm going to go with the whole, you know, you will see this in action rather than me having to sort of do 30 pages on each section or something. So it could actually end up being a significant chunk. But yeah, no, this is good. This was cool. This filled in all the gaps for me.